Hi everyone, today we're going to be discussing the application of VAB. All the materials that we are discussing today can be found in Chapter 2. And we're going to focus a lot on methods that you can employ in your own classroom once we get back to that face-to-face teaching. So your book starts out discussing the gatekeepers of success. There are 4 major strategies that you need to employ to ensure that your classroom is culturally responsive. And these major strategies include a culture responsive classroom management, culture responsive academic vocabulary, a culture responsive academic literacy, and culture responsive academic language. And so today's lecture, what we're going to be doing is we're going to break down these 4 major strategies and discuss specific methods that you can employ to ensure that you're attempting all 4 strategies when you're teaching. So the first strategy is a responsive classroom management. For those that are not familiar with this term, classroom management is basically how do you maintain order in your classroom? How do you establish the rules and regulations of your classroom? How do students know the expectations of themselves in the classroom? And how do you maintain order? So we're going to be discussing 4 subcategories of responsive classroom management, and those include the use of attention signals, the use of protocols for responding, the use of discussion, the use of movement, and the use of extended collaboration activities. And the first one we're going to discuss is the use of attention signals. Attention signals are really important for both the students and the teachers. This is basically how does the teacher bring everyone back onto topic. So once the bell rings for high school, how do your students know that it's time to get down to getting work done? Or if you break students out into collaborative groups or into active learning, how do you bring them all back to topic at the end of the activity? And so there's a lot of different ways you can do this. In elementary school, they use whole brain learning a lot, in which teachers use a response system where they might say something like class, class, and then the students say yes, yes. In high school, students are not really as much into that, although you could try to do something like who dat, or you could use a saying or a motto from your high school and have your students repeat something back. Here's a video of a secondary education teacher who doesn't actually use an oral response, but a hand signal instead.
My students are very fun. They like to talk, so using an attention signal is the easiest way to get them to quiet down and really refocus their attention. All right, everybody, give me 5. All right. Thank you so much. As a high school teacher, I love the attention signal. I do it while we're in groups or while we're discussing class appropriate things, so it's easy for me to get their attention, and they think that it's fine. They enjoy it and it gets their attention. It works.
So as we saw with that woman's classroom, she used the give me 5. You could get really creative with this. If your school has a mascot, if there's a particular sports team or pop culture hand signal that you want to use, this may be what you'd want to try to use. There's also protocols for responding. Something you want to make sure of when you are calling on students in your classroom is you want to ensure that you're randomly calling on them and that you're not always calling on the same students. Students might start to feel like they're getting picked on. They might notice that you're only calling on the girls, or you're only calling on the boys, or maybe you're only calling on the 3 students in the front row. And so one way that you can do this is you can use the popsicle stick method. And this is a video explaining the popsicle stick method, which is the easiest way to increase randomized response.
Popsicle sticks, they're basically a tool that we use for random selection of students. So we put their names, once we get the rosters, and you put them on a popsicle stick, and then you put them in a cup. And when we ask questions, you know how some kids are very hesitant to volunteer. Well, we let the popsicle sticks in the cup volunteer for 'em. Shake them up, pick the name out, and if their name is chosen, then it's their question, or it's their opportunity to answer.
Popsicle sticks, I like them just because I tend to kind of focus on asking certain people questions. So it kind of keeps me in check and it gets me to ask people who I wouldn't normally think of. So I'm not asking like the person that I know knows the answer or somebody who's struggling. I'm just asking a random person. You were destined to answer this question. That's what I tell them.
I myself am a big fan of popsicle sticks, particularly for classes where you're not getting robust participation, because now everyone knows that they have to participate. There's also a lot of protocols for collaborative activities and discussions that I'm going to discuss after I get my child up from nap time. So I will continue this very shortly. Okay, so with secondary education, we do a lot of discussions. And I think we've all participated in a discussion or have tried to execute a discussion that has fallen flat. So these are a couple different ways that you can create culture responsive discussion protocols. And what they do is they make everyone participate, no matter who they are, what level they're at, if you're gifted and talented, you're disabled, English is a second language, or if culturally they're not encouraged to speak up in class. So if you look to your left, you can see the culture responsive discussion protocols. And I'm going to go over a few of these so you understand them a little bit better. The first one is numbered heads together. What happens is it's kind of like a think, pair, share. You put a group of students together to discuss a problem. They need to agree on an answer or solution. And then you have your desks or seats numbered, and you roll a dice. And whatever number that dice comes upon, that person has to speak for the rest of the group. So it makes every single person in that group responsible for being able to respond and understand the group's consensus to the problem. The other one is give one, get one. In this case, you use order to walk around the room and find a partner to discuss our learning. And then when we're finished listening and sharing, we return immediately to our seats, and then we can hear from each partner. The other is put 2 cents in. I really like this one. In groups of 4, we each take turns talking by putting 1 cent in the center of the table and sharing. Once everyone has shared, we then put 1 more cent in to respond to what someone else in our group has shared. And what's great about this is you, for the instructor, is you visually can see where the groups are at in their discussion because you can see how many pennies are in the middle of the table. I really like that one. The other one is round robin brainstorming. What you do is at our table group, we each take turns sharing our thoughts about our learning while the assigned scribe takes notes about our ideas. When we're finished, we're all ready to share with the class what we discussed. With round robin, as well as the numbered heads together and jigsaw, every single person needs to have an assigned job. And we discuss collaborative learning in about a week or two. We're going to discuss more about intentionally grouping our students and how we can assign specific tasks like being the scribe or the reporter for the group. And finally, this one I really enjoy, particularly for science and social studies, but also if you need to tackle a large swath of literature to read, and that's jigsaw. So in groups of 4, each of us is assigned material to learn. Then the students across the class focusing on the same material get together and they basically become subject matter experts. So you count your students off 1, 2, 3, 4. They have a home group, but then all the ones get together and they learn a very specific piece to whatever you're teaching. And the 2s get together and the 3s and the 4s. Once they become subject matter experts, they go back to their home group and they teach each other what they just learned. So those are a couple of ways that you can create culture responsive discussions. In addition to that, consider doing things like using movement. I particularly like this if you have students towards the end of the day, the beginning of the day, or if you end up in middle school where students still are trying to learn self-control and still might have the wiggles. It's also a great way to wake your students up. So maybe you need to do stations around the classroom, or maybe you just need to get them up and do some sort of responsiveness with you, where they need to do jumping jack or they need to get up and stretch. And then also, I'm a big fan of using extended collaborative activities. So that might be problem-based learning or project-based learning or active learning that involves grouping students together that normally wouldn't be grouped together, as that helps students get to know each other, communicate with each other, and create more of a unified classroom. The next one is responsive academic vocabulary. Here, I want you to consider when you're assigning reading either from the textbook or from various novels or even giving instructions, are you using leveled vocabulary? And what that means is, will your students actually understand what they're learning? I find this to be a tremendous issue, particularly in the sciences, because we throw so much jargon at our students and then they only understand the concepts in the terms of their textbook, but if you ask them to describe it in their own words, they can't, and that means they haven't learned it. So ways that you can combat this include using a personal thesaurus or personal dictionary tools, and I'm going to show you one in just a minute. You can also use analogies. I love using analogies. For example, I just had to write a piece for Nichols State University involving why we should wash our hands and how soap is better than hand sanitizers to combat the coronavirus. And I gave the analogy about Dawn dishwashing soap. Have you guys ever watched a dishwashing soap commercial? It's always someone showing you this greasy pan and then they put it in soapy water and all of a sudden all the grease breaks up. Similarly, the coronavirus has an envelope around it made up of fat or lipids that they get from your own cells. And so if you wash your hands, that soap is going to break up that fat around the virus just like it would on your dirty dishes, and that inactivates the virus. So do you see the analogy I just made there, where I'm discussing something we're all familiar with, doing the dishes, to something very complicated like why soap inactivates a virus? Another way we can do this is using the Marzano six-step process. And I'm going to show you this video on it. And next time I'll make sure I actually embed my YouTube videos into my PowerPoint.
All right, our vocabulary word for this week that we're going to focus on is formulate. Can you please repeat after me? Formulate.
Formulate.
One more time. Formulate.
Formulate.
What I always try to do is use Marzano's 6 steps. The idea is that we identify the word and we say the word. The students speak about the word. They give examples. They have a picture that associates with the word. They have a game, and then they are periodically challenged to use the word, read about the word, speak and listen to the word, define that word. What I want you to do right now is, whether you know this word or not, I want you to think in your head, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you hear the word formulate? Hold on, take a second. So formulate, what's the first thing that comes into mind when you hear the word formulate? Michael, what's the first thing that comes into mind when you think of formulate?
The first thing that comes into my mind when I hear the word formulate is to create something.
To create something, very good. I emphasize Tier 2 vocabulary words because these are the words that students are going to come across in their reading and their writing within all their different classes, not just their English language arts classes, their science, their history, their math classes, their elective courses. I always try to teach 1 to 2 words per week, and that's the limit for my Tier 2 vocabulary. The reason why is I really want the students to get deep with that word, to spend some quality time with that word and understanding what that word means.
If a 6th grader student asked me to formulate a plan to be successful in 7th grade, I would say, be yourself and try to study real hard for all the tests.
How is this formulate? What is this formulate?
He was trying to create a plan to get the balloon.
Using American Sign Language, not only is there another way to associate the word, but for kinesthetic learners, A lot of students, I've seen a lot of students suddenly understand the word in the context of that gesture, that movement. Formulate. So it's this way to this way. Okay? Do it again. Formulate. Look at the definition. To create or devise a strategy. To create or devise a strategy. On Tuesday, I had a starter where I just used the word formulate in one of the questions. We're in the middle of a RCD unit on writing argument essays. So what I wanted them to do was to choose a certain amount of vocabulary words. I called it their vocabulary challenge. How many words are you going to do for the vocabulary challenge? Which words?
Predict, evaluate, and develop patterns.
Okay. On Friday, I always try to incorporate an activity, an engaging kind of game. Another tenet to Marzano's vocabulary philosophy is to have a game, to use the word in a fun way. But also, I think it creates a little bit more engagement. When they have fun, students tend to sometimes forget that they're learning. All right, here we go. And the word is organize.
Organize. Oh my God.
Okay, so we saw the Marzano 6-step process, and I highly recommend that you try that even if you don't teach English, if you're teaching math, science, history, if they're key terms, you can do that. More about leveled vocabulary. So here's an example of leveled vocabulary. If you ask someone what is web development, someone could give you the definition. Web development broadly refers to tasks associated with developing websites for hosting via intranet. The web development process includes web design, web content development, client-side, server-side, scripting, network security, configuration, among other tasks. If you're not familiar with computer science or web development, a lot of that is not going to make any sense to you. Like, what's server-side scripting and what's network security configuration? And I don't want you to feel like when we're using level vocabulary, we're supposed to dumb down what we're saying. But what I want you to think about is, can you meet your students where they're at? And then teach them the specific vocabulary needed to describe different concepts. For example, if you were introducing web development to your students, then you could talk about how computers are used to share pictures, words, and movies, usually of cats, with other computers. And those computers need to show the cats on boxes with tiny lights in them, but don't know how. So people like me tell the computer many words so that it knows how to change the tiny lights to look like a cat. We try to make the lights change very fast so that you don't have to wait for your cats. And some days the lights light up all wrong and we have to tell the computer more words to make them look like cats again. So that's just a way for you to really simplify terminology and concepts. And I think this is so important, particularly for your English as a second language learners, because these students really need to understand concepts in very basic English language before you can get them to understand specific vocabulary to that concept. Here's an example of a personal dictionary thesaurus. So here, this teacher, what they say is they're asking you to identify words while reading. And this is modified from the book, The ELL Teacher's Toolbox. And so what this teacher does is they want you to list a paragraph number and then write the specific word. And then they want you to define the word in your own words. And this is so important because students can look up the definition of a word, but if they themselves cannot own it by defining it themselves in some way, then they have not learned that word. And then if you have a visual learner, you can have them draw a picture, or if English is a second language or they have a learning disability, sometimes pictures can be extremely helpful. And then you have them use that word in their own sentence. So maybe they need to use that word in a sentence that makes more sense to them in their everyday lives. Another way you can make your classroom more culturally inclusive is by including responsive academic literacy. So what does that mean? That means when you choose a text, and it doesn't matter what you are teaching, you could be using word problems in math, you could be teaching very specific things that are happening in history, you could be creating problem-based learning in your science classes, or giving word problems in your science class or certain scenarios, or if you are an English teacher or a literacy teacher, you need to think about like, who are the characters? What are their names? Are we choosing characters from all different backgrounds? Do these characters look like your students? Do they sound like your students? Is the theme of the text relatable? Even math word problems. Right now, I'm discussing with my elementary education majors when they are making word math problems, really think about what you're talking about. One of my students had created a word problem about mini golf and then realized, based on the socioeconomic level of our students, that many of them have probably never played mini golf. So maybe we need to change it to kickball or basketball or a different type of game. Um, Also, use engaging read alouds. A lot of cultures value storytelling. So even though you might be teaching high school, creating engaging stories, or if you're reading Hamlet or Shakespeare, really getting into it using voice inflection, that is going to create a more culturally inclusive atmosphere, and that will help your students understand. If you read Goodnight Moon and were like, good night, room. Good night, red balloons. Good night, mouse. Good night, cat. Like, that's not exciting. But if you were like, good night, room. Good night, red balloons. Good night, little mice. And the cats and the red balloons, that might help your students remember things. Also, consider using different types of literacy activities. So, it's particularly if you're teaching ELA, you can incorporate things like music and poetry and journal entries for your students to really get into the text. And you can also have students make music videos about other things like scientific concepts or historical events that have occurred during a certain time. Those can all be really helpful ways to make your class a lot more culturally responsive. Other things you can do things like sentence lifting, and I left on your Moodle page instructions on how to use sentence lifting. But what it is if you are seeing common issues in your students' writing, let's say they're not using apostrophes correctly or commas, then what you can do is, as a class, you can analyze a bunch of sentences together and identify the grammatical issues that are occurring. And it's a great way for you to tackle an issue in writing that the majority of your students are having without singling out any of those students at once. You can also use role playing. So have your students act out the plays that they're reading or even the books that they're reading, or you could have them act out specific scenes. You can also have students retell a story that they read or a current event or maybe even like a scientific discovery from back in the day. Maybe you could be like, how do you think Isaac Newton reacted when this happened, or Darwin? Or what do you think President George Washington really felt when he became the first president? And you could have your students retell it from the perspective of these historical folks. And then also the use of revising. I love peer-to-peer revising, and I also think it's really important that you scaffold your writing assignments and really help your students tackle issues they're having in their writing early on. So if you have them writing a multiple page paper or a response or an essay in your exam, you need them to practice that skill and you need to scaffold them up. So maybe you have them write their introductory paragraph or the introductory sentences and then have them revise each other's, and you go around and spot check. And that will help your students stay on task and also understand what they're doing well and what they need to improve upon. It also makes that mountain of an assignment more of a molehill because they can take little bites out of the assignment as they move on. And finally, I want you to think about giving your students the opportunity to code switch. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this, and I'm going to show you this video. But code switching is all about allowing your students to express themselves in the language that they would use at home, but also understanding when it's appropriate to use the linguistics that they use in their own cultures versus how to be successful in our current society, which means that they need to code switch between what's appropriate in the classroom and what's at home, but also allowing your students the opportunity to use their cultural language for certain assignments. So here's a great YouTube video about code switching.
Who's got bottomless steak fries by the basketful?
It's hard to manage your workload, especially when your team doesn't know who's working on what. But with Monday.com, my team and I can...
Good evening. Before we get started, I would like to define two things for you. The first thing I would like to define for you is something called the first 8 rule. I learned the first 8 rule at a life seminar at Emory University over the summer. A woman named Dr. Tolbert told me and my classmates that people often judge you within the first 8 feet, 8 seconds, and 8 words that come out of your mouth. Crazy, right? The second thing I would like to define for you is a term called code switching. Now, people often define code switching as the change in linguistics, but to me, it's more than that. It's the way you dress, the way you talk, the way you present yourself in certain situations. Before I get started, I would like to tell you a little bit about where I'm from and how I learned to code switch. I come from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I went to school in the inner city, or what some consider the hood. We talk different in my city. We dress different on my side of town from others. Oftentimes, I would greet my homegirls with the girl, where you been at? So-and-so party tonight. What's the word? What's the move? I often spoke with the slang of my city. You perpin', ain't nobody say that. Code for you're lying, nobody just said what you said. I even dressed different. My jeans, my sneakers. Oftentimes girls wore their head wraps until they got to their destination so the weather wouldn't mess up their do. Then I came to this big switch in my life. I moved to a wealthier part of town and I started going to school with predominantly white kids. It was a culture shock for me. I wasn't sure how to act. I was always intelligent. I always had manners, but when I never had to display them where I was from. I didn't know what to do. I was in this building full of no one who looked like me. No one had on their scarves. Everyone used these gargantuan lexicons or large vocabularies. I knew I had it, but again, I didn't have to impress the people back on my side of town, so I never used it. They dressed business casually, did things that where I come from, like stare, was not okay. So for weeks I didn't speak. I didn't say anything. I was afraid of being judged, even though I knew I had it in me. But I didn't want to change who I was just to fit in at this new school. So I went home to my sister, who knows far more about life than I do. And this is where she taught me about code switching. She told me that I didn't have to change who I was as a person, meaning my morals, values, what I stood for, what I found okay and not okay. But sometimes I had to put away my slang and bring out my gargantuan lexicon. Put away my ripped jeans and my head wrap and put on my business suit coat. and my khakis and flats. And not to impress them, but to survive in my environment for the time. Basically telling me, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. So I did that. I no longer wore my head wrap out of the house. I no longer wore my ripped jeans. I wasn't afraid to answer questions in class and compete for my spot. I used my gargantuan lexicon. I code switched. I was always who I was. I just changed my demeanor to fit the situation at hand. Many people code switch. One of our president, Barack Obama. We know that when Barack Obama is up there for a press conference or in front of the American people in his suit and tie, he's going to get it done. He is about his business. Then we know that side of Obama where he's relaxed, where the ball players come to his house, his leather jacket. Yo, bro, it's cool. Yeah. We know that he can relate to us. Again, we always knew what Obama stood for, what he found okay, not okay, his morals, his values. We knew it. But he changed his demeanor to fit the situation at hand, aka code switched. Business men and women. You wouldn't go to China with only American customs and expect people to be comfortable or want to do business with you. No, you learn some of their customs. You get comfortable with their way of doing things so that they know you care. You care about us. You want to fit in enough. So yeah, we can do that business with you. Not many people know how to code switch, let alone code switch and be themselves. Bringing you back to that first 8 rule where people often judge you within that first 8 feet, 8 seconds, and 8 words that come out of your mouth. Afraid that changing yourself for that situation at hand might make people feel like you're phony or fake. It's not the case at all.
So you can continue to watch the video. It's really a great one, but I do think it's important that we address code switching because you're going to see it in your high schools. But I also think it's important because it's a skill that students need to learn to be successful in the current society that we're in. And finally, think about your classroom environment itself. Is your classroom environment inviting and is it culturally responsive? Your book talks a lot about the de-Blumenbach, decommercialize, and de-superficialize your classroom. What that means is don't harbor stereotypes with the visuals that you create in your classroom. Don't show basketball players that are only of one race. Don't show professionals that are of only one race or sex, like doctors that are only white males. If you're going to show pictures of people, show them of all different colors, all different abilities, and reflect on the students that you have in your classroom. Also, consider showing some real inspirational folks. There are wonderful companies out there where you can download and print for free women in science, minorities in science, historical figures that students might not normally learn about, like Chavez. There's really great math posters. There's so many great things that you can put on your walls. So when you're considering getting into your classroom environment and decorating it, think about how your space is organized, how are learning materials selected, how is furniture arranged, and what types of symbols, colors, and languages are you using in your classroom to ensure that your classroom is culturally responsive. Finally, here's a picture of a high school, and you can see how we see a lot of different students working. Notice the tables. This high school helps promotes group work. Note that there's a lot of things on the boards and things around the classroom. Note that the students have the ability to use their laptops, which is great that these students have these laptops. Look at how we are seeing different colors of students around, and it just looks like a warm and inviting place to get work done. Thank you all for listening to this lecture. If you have any questions about the materials presented, please email me. I'm happy to Zoom conference with you during this difficult time, and I look forward to reading your responses on the discussion board. Have a great week. Thank you.